Welcome to BeyondBIM. The digitization of the building lifecycle has been talked about for quite some time, and we've covered this topic extensively in our podcast. But to reach its vision, it requires transformative services and also experiences. In today's episode, we delve into the Digital Building Lifecycle framework introduced to us by Salla Eckhardt. Salla Eckhardt is the Director of Transformation Services at Microsoft. Salla identifies herself as an innovation leader and an industry change agent specialized in digital transformation of the digital building lifecycle. But she's also been widely recognized as one of the most innovative and forward-thinking people in the AEC sector. And she has a mission, and her strategy is to unify a clear vision around digital building lifecycle framework, which is to consolidate the physical, social, and digital environments as a data-centric entity, and also empower the end-user experiences with emerging technologies throughout the building's lifecycle. And now, let's take a listen to what Salla has to say on the digital building lifecycle framework. First and foremost, Salla, it's really great to be able to connect with you. Could you just start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and what led you to your current role as Director of Transformation Services at Microsoft?
Thank you, Erica. Yes, it's a pleasure to meet your audience and you, Erica, and talk about how I ended up where I am right now. And I began my career back in Finland, where I'm from, and I studied my master's degree in architecture and then sprinkled a little bit of engineering into it. I was planning on doing dual masters, but then decided that that's not probably the best case. So I used the credits that I completed for a construction management and civil engineering towards a PhD degree. But that's kind of been sitting in the backbone or back burner when I moved to the United States about 5 years ago. Before I moved here, I did a few years of architectural design and structural engineering just to see what I'm missing out on, because I chose to have a different career track back in the day. And before I moved, I was leading EU-funded smart city program in Finland, and that way I was already kind of looking into the future of the AECO industry. And when I moved to Seattle, I joined the dark side of the industry, general contracting, and I had the pleasure of being the VDC manager for some projects that we were developing outside of Washington State and then in the greater Seattle area for a couple of different big general contractor companies here. And I became the director of emerging technology and innovation for one of the largest GCs in the region, taking forward reality capture and building information models, digital construction. I built the digital construction and digital contractor strategy for the company and started looking into extended reality as one of the streamlines. And then Microsoft learned about what I was doing and contacted me when they established the Center of Innovation for our internal real estate and security organization. And then I joined Microsoft about 2 years ago. And I've been driving digital building lifecycle forward ever since.
That sounds exciting. I always find that so many of my speakers start out in architecture and then go on to do something completely different or somehow something very creative in a different industry. It seems like the architectural degree perhaps allows people this transition in, I don't know whether it's the way in which they're taught to think creatively or what, but somehow they end up doing everything except architecture, but still as exciting and as novel. You recently authored a number or series of articles on LinkedIn called the Digital Building Lifecycle. So can you explain to our listeners, what do you mean by the digital building lifecycle? What does that entail?
Thank you. Yes. So the reason why I developed this is that based on my experience, 20 years in the industry, I've discovered that the different disciplines continue to work in bubbles, in their own silos, and focusing on each phase of delivering the technical life cycle of the building. But now that the industry is going through the digital transformation and we are trying to reach the other industries in terms of how we digitize and how much do we use the technology for supporting people working in the industry, I discovered that maybe there is a niche for me to carve out the bigger picture and explain to people how they are actually interconnected through the technical life cycle of the building or the infrastructure and go beyond that. Hence, I developed the framework of digital building lifecycle. So we have the thorough understanding already in the planning phase that what is the end in mind thinking? What are we actually aiming to deliver in terms of the total performance of our physical, digital, and social environments? And what does it mean as the total cost of ownership or as the total cost? Because not everyone is an owner, but they need to be thinking about, do they have the reasonable funds to deliver what they are planning on delivering or dreaming about delivering? And with the complexity that comes from the smart environments, smart buildings, and smart campuses, smart cities, there's so much data available that traditionally remains as dark data. So with the digital building lifecycle, we are shining more light on what we already have and what might we actually do with it so that we don't end up replicating and repeating the mistakes from the past, but we really start to think about what does the future of the industry look like when we pull those ideas and visions from the future, not from the past.
Okay, I think that perhaps we can go dig deeper into this. So in one of those articles, it states, and I quote, "It is a method which takes a long view of a building's life cycle, thus enabling efficiencies, proactive maintenance, predictive operations, and maximized investments through data." And finally, it says, "Technologies help to make this possible." Can you elaborate which technologies you foresee are going to make that a reality?
Yes, it might be that a lot of those technologies haven't been developed yet, but are kind of at the verge of becoming a streamline for developing them. But traditionally speaking, we already have fully functional building information models and the modeling tools, the authoring tools. And now there's the emerging digital twin tools that are entering the market. We already have the Internet of Things and Internet of Actions, a lot of sensors that have already been developed that you can integrate into the physical environment and post-install if you're dealing with a lot of legacy buildings. So overall, the components of technology already exist. And when throwing in a little bit of extended reality, consuming the data that we can extract from the physical environment or from the digital environment, it's very consumable for the end user. So we don't have to have 20 years of experience in reading 2D drawings or something that is very discipline specific. We can just step into the virtual world and start experiencing. And whenever there's something that triggers a question, then we can point that out for the subject matter expert and continue developing further rather than struggle with the skills that we might have or might not have. So overall, I think that the technology framework already exists. A lot more is coming. A lot of the existing tools are being enriched with artificial intelligence and machine learning. So those are capabilities that are supporting the machine side of the collaboration. And that way, the human-machine collaboration continues forward. And I see great things coming.
Yeah, in many ways, that's actually what spurred on this particular podcast, to actually go and look beyond what we're constantly focusing on or have been for quite some time, which is BIM, and also to encourage listeners and people out there to go and explore many other technologies that are all part of the bigger transformation that you talked about as well. But I wonder if this digital building lifecycle approach that you describe, it seems closer and closer aligned with what we've been hearing a lot lately, that is the development and use of digital twins. So how far away is that vision from what we're trying to also now pull into our sector, which is digitally twinning buildings, for example?
It's not that far away, and there are already platforms that are within the proprietary ecosystem of building information models and then enriching them into digital twins. But what I'm hoping for from the industry is that we start really embracing the platform thinking and thinking about how do we create the digital cores for our individual organizations, but make the digital mix of the tools in a way that we are not confining ourselves into only a proprietary ecosystem, but we choose which tools are actually usable for the project team that is working on things. And that way it can be basically competitors collaborating together, but integrating on a single cloud-based platform. And that way, once we start to understand that and accept the global and international national standards that are the foundation for the technology integration, and we have more interoperable data flowing between the organizations and project teams, that's when we start to see the business use cases and the business value in using these technologies. Trying to first develop the use cases, it will be an unending list, unlimited list of use cases, but they will never have the foundation ready for supporting them unless we work together as an industry.
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with what you said there about platform thinking and ecosystems thinking. I think that our sector still has a long way to go with adopting this mindset. It is becoming more talked about in recent years, and we can see, at least with the big software vendors, an ecosystems approach or a platform approach to how they are offering services. And indeed, there's growing number of startups, and there's a lot of new entrants in the construction technology market on its own, for instance, but also in property technology. So it is shifting. Do you have any examples maybe from the work that you're doing? Are you seeing any success stories in this type of platform thinking or ecosystems thinking?
Yes, I definitely do see some success stories, and good examples from our partner network are like Bentley Systems or Willow, if I can mention a couple of names, and how they are interoperable with a lot of their competitors. And that way they are supporting the end user choose what belongs in their digital core, what tools do they want to use, because it's about that end user experience and not confining everyone into a single one-stop solution that they have to adapt to, but they can look into their digital toolbox and see what they have and be confident that they can actually produce the data and information that can be pulled into other platforms. And that way there is no that traditional cut off, or there is no need for rolling back into the traditional ways of working, producing the 2D drawings that I'm sure that people who've heard me speak before realize that I'm becoming fully allergic to 2D drawings in paper format or in digital paper if talking about PDFs. There is a need for a kind of building the collaboration and not reinventing the wheel. So if already someone has a tool, that someone then develops the same tool and everything remains the same. We need to work more collaboratively to expand the horizons and share the resources that can then deliver the transformational change that the industry needs. I personally don't see that we have a lot of options anymore as an industry in terms of digitalization. The productivity and profitability of the projects that we are dealing with are so low that I think that people are kind of choosing the industry out of the love for the sport, so to speak, and not because it's actually a profitable business. But that's just my opinion and my insight into things. Someone might have a different opinion.
But that's interesting that you talk about profitability. In one sense, actually, this is the approach that we take as well within our research and what we talk about, which is focusing more on business model innovation as well. So it's not just a piecemeal approach to using technology. It's also rethinking about how each business is actually generating value. And I guess this ties in very much with that long-term thinking about the whole building life cycle. And even in many ways, I can see a lot of synergy with what you're saying and what we're trying to achieve, which is like a positive feedback loop from how the building is actually performing back to the design tools and systems, which seems very difficult to implement. Because of the life cycle of buildings, but it's not impossible. We are seeing this in aviation. We are seeing it in the automotive sectors. Granted, they're very different, but those technologies are inherently already available, like you said.
Exactly. And when thinking about BIM-based design and engineering, and then the digital twins that have a BIM as a component in them, we already have a lot of data that is revealing to us how is the built environment anticipated to perform when the architects are designing the social performance of the building and engineers are designing the technical performance of the buildings. We already have a lot of the data that we can simulate and analyze when we haven't built anything yet. And with that, it should be that the mindset is that we first fully develop and design and build the physical infrastructure in a digital format. And then the physical format is the twin. Now is a lot of the other way around, that we talk about the digital twin of legacy buildings, but that's when we have very limited ways and means to fix anything because everything has already been decided. And the cost of change is very high. So if we change the mindset and start thinking about what are we actually aiming to deliver and have that end in mind approach, then the designers are not limited to deliver that design intent or the contractors to deliver the physical artifact, but everyone collaborates together to really optimize the high performance of the physical, digital, and social environment, and that way avoid unnecessary costs, but think about things as an investment in the long term, and that way create that added value for the original team and those that come after. And that way, whenever we are making changes into our physical environment, we aim at improving it. Not only that individual part, but the overall big picture.
Yeah, and that is exactly what you said, is the platform thinking, where you're having to now think of your competitors as collaborators in an ecosystem. So it really is a fundamental shift culturally, I feel, for the industry, because it is for such a prolonged time had like pipeline business model thinking, and it still exists even in manufacturing, albeit they're more advanced. It still is an inherent problem, but that is slowly shifting, as from what you're saying as well with the examples you provided. Now, if we take a long-term view in terms of services or innovation in the services, what sort of innovation in services might you foresee with that building lifecycle approach in the future?
Good one. I love this question because I've already kind of put the idea out there, but I'm really hoping that there would be some startups that start managing only the digital real estate, not the physical facility management and what goes into our physical world and the end user services, but start looking into what does it mean to manage the digital real estate portfolio and the legacy buildings that need to be brought into that world as well. I think there is a lot of opportunity to grow that. And so far, I haven't seen anyone do it, at least in its pure form. So if anyone is brave enough out there, go for it. I want to hear how it goes. It does require very different thinking, but it also requires a lot of experience from the past, that what didn't work or where are the bottlenecks and how the technology could be supporting people and the businesses. So not taking the technology first approach, but really thinking about what needs to improve and what needs to transform so that we don't try to fix something that is fundamentally broken.
Could you explain that a little bit more in slightly more detail? Because it's piqued my interest when you say digital real estate management. So is that more about managing insights or managing the performance related data of that building? What does that look like?
It could be managing the digital physical building, everything that is the IoT networks, and collecting data about the building technical performance, and really seeing that what can we pull as the forecast of where things are going. Is there something that needs to be replaced, and what goes into kind of the traditional facility management side and building maintenance side, but instead of being in reactive mode, really thinking about the proactive maintenance and predictive operations based on the data and evidence that can be collected from the building. But then also tying in the social performance. So if we can tie in the Internet of Actions data and really start to understand how are people actually using the buildings, why do they actually arrive into a specific location to do something, what is a strategic workplace for the future end users, etc. So again, pulling all that data, analyzing the data into information that can be then clustered into intelligence and knowledge for the decision makers that are looking to invest more into their portfolio, then managing all the data streams and analyzing and processing the data so that the raw data might be available for multitudes of different end users and decision makers, but then how do you actually process the data into information that is then relevant for individual stakeholders, because there might be different combinations of information that are relevant for different types of managers or service providers or anything. And overall, there is an emergence of different types of roles for experience managers, for example. And when we have the digital virtual building as well, that brings us into the BIM world and digital twins world, GIS. What might we do with that data if we combine that with the digital physical building? And that way, the digital real estate business kind of reveals itself in a completely different way than the traditional real estate operations have been.
I think the thing that I picked up on that is when you mentioned customer experience and focusing on that. So in the service innovation domain or in manufacturing, there's a lot of talk about moving into obviously servitization, right? So there's a big push for creating new services and new experiences. Perhaps the most common example is that of lifts. So you step into a lift, it knows where you live, takes you to the correct floor, and that is reliant on a digital experience, right? And a physical experience together. And so it seems that in the future, buildings would potentially become more responsive to the human occupant needs, where we previously hadn't had that. We have so much responsiveness in other digital tools, from Netflix to Facebook and all these tools that we're all used to using, but there still is this huge divide in terms of any kind of information or responsiveness when it comes to the buildings that we occupy, which seems so strange that it's taken so long for this industry in particular to innovate in the service side.
Exactly. And there's already a lot of talk about cognitive buildings, but I haven't heard a lot of people talk about the customer journey that you're describing already, and what type of spaces should we have in individual buildings so that we start to digitalize more of those end user experiences rather than assigning a specific space for a specific activity. And when thinking about already existing technologies, what about the cave environments? That you can have large screens as your wall structure, and all you have to do is just step into the environment and start consuming the data that you want to consume, or working with your remote colleagues and remote teams collaboratively. So it's a very inclusive space. It's very accessible space. You don't have to have a lot of physical furniture to enable people to work in those environments. And that way, when thinking about the future usage of the spaces, it's very flexible, because you don't have to define exactly that, oh, this is a room for having meetings for this size of people, or it's only for focusing on something that you're working on individually. It's very flexible, and the meeting or the room usage can be very ad hoc, and that way more agile for the end user experiences and the customer journey.
Yeah, and I think that way of thinking, agility, is so common in the IT world that it's again a cultural shift for our industry to change the way that it inherently thinks about value, customer experiences, and responsiveness. And many industries have started out to move into that direction, obviously, and this is part of their digital transformation. I think there's still a long way to go certainly in the built environment to adopt this model and way of thinking, but it's not unheard of because we are seeing a lot of startups and new entrants in the market, which is exciting to see. And I think it's been a long-awaited kind of journey as well.
Definitely. And when thinking about the existing buildings and the legacy portfolios and how expensive it is to make changes into your shell and core, what about the manufacturing industry and the furniture industry? Why not start collaborating more closely with them, where the technical life cycle of their products is much shorter than it is for our physical buildings and infrastructure? And that way start thinking completely differently, that how do we actually create the end user experiences, the customer journeys that we want to deliver for our customers and end users, and that way start thinking completely differently. Start from a clean slate, so to speak, and not get buckled down by what are the limitations. If there are limitations, what are the opportunities, and are there opportunities somewhere else than what we currently see?
That's great. I think finally, for a lot of our listeners, you will be, especially for female engineers within male-dominated industries, it's always interesting to hear from your perspective and your voice in terms of making a change or giving advice to perhaps early career researchers or early career engineers. What advice would you give to them when trying to pursue change or impact in our sector? As we know, it's renowned for its reluctance to innovate. What are some of the tips and tricks that you've come to notice, or any advice that you might want to share with our listeners?
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. And first thing that comes to my mind is that support others without expecting them to support you. So it's more about giving than taking. And that way you can build up your network of people that are interested in what you're doing, and you can kind of have the discussions about where you're aiming at, but not forcing your ideas on others, but really kind of giving the helping hand for those that are working on something else. And then working together with everyone. So I do understand that there is a need for pushing a lot of female careers and drumming for the females. I think we should be more focusing on people and thinking about how do we actually think differently so that we don't, again, repeat the mistakes of the past and tie something into the female researcher did something, a researcher did something, and we should be focusing on the results. So for those who are in the early phases of their careers, deliver results and be that continuous innovation flywheel that others can then start working based on what you already delivered. And that way just put a lot of effort into it. It doesn't come easy. It's taken me 20 years to get where I am, and I'm still not at the final destination of the journey. So it's be passionate about what you're doing. And if you don't have the passion, maybe there's something else to be discovered, and learn from everyone, but more importantly, teach everyone. So it's to learn it all, know it all is very good, but there is a need for sharing more of the knowledge that we already have so that we don't end up being the dark data warehouse and keeping everything for ourselves, wondering why nobody else understands what we understand because we very deep dived into something. So teaching others, supporting others, that would be the route that I recommend.
Thank you for tuning in to listen to BeyondBIM podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more from our latest episodes, then you can visit BeyondBIM, which is available on SoundCloud and iTunes and all the other major podcast providers.